And now another Sandy-related headache for the governor and his administration. There are claims that the Christie team has simply misused the money it got for Sandy rebuilding, denying claims of storm victims incorrectly and even for faulty reasons, as well as rejecting a higher proportion of claims by minorities or renters and failing to oversee the money properly or provide even basic transparency about how they're reaching decisions about what money is going where. Now, for more on this, we are joined by Kevin Walsh. Kevin's an attorney, associate director of Fair Share Housing Center, and he joins us tonight from Cherry Hill in New Jersey. Kevin, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I guess a lot of people are surprised that here we are in February, and are we saying we still don't know what money is going where and how they're deciding who's getting prioritized and who isn't?
That's right. The administration promised us a recovery that would be quick but also fair, and we haven't gotten either of those. Governor Christie, soon after the storm, did a great job reaching out to people, but in the past several months and even before then, there started to be signs that something wasn't going quite right. We started getting phone calls and emails from people who were clearly had terrible damage to their house, but they were denied because they hadn't had enough damage to their house. And what we found out in looking at data recently that we got from the state was that the state was denying people and then telling them they had to appeal. And when people appealed, if they appealed, the state very often granted their application. And what we saw in looking at the data was that 80% of the people who applied for the two biggest funding sources, when they appealed, their appeal was granted. So they had an 80% error rate, which is just astounding. For the state to do something wrong 80% of the time, nobody should stand for that. And the state has not disputed it. In fact, it's acknowledged that that was the error rate, and it's blaming it on FEMA. It said FEMA gave it bad data.
Before we get into the tired history of how we got to where we are, right now as we stand, and the governor's office said they're going to appropriate another nearly $1.5 billion, do we know who's in charge of the recovery effort? Do we know who at least is accountable for where the money goes?
Yeah, well, the buck certainly stopped with the governor, and he is a cabinet member who's leading the effort, but they recently fired the lead contractor, which had a $70 million contract. There's been no accountability as to why that group was fired, whether that group quit, whether it was fired, whether it was fired for incompetence, whether it was fired because for some other reason. Nobody will answer any of those questions. And the secrecy around all this is what causes as much concern as anything. Nobody expects something like this to be something that has no mistakes made. But when you make mistakes and then you either cover them up or you don't acknowledge them, it's what has our phone ringing off the hook from people who are affected by the storm, who are still out of their homes or are living in moldy conditions, and are just very aggravated that they're out of their homes, that mistakes are made, and that there isn't the willingness of the state to correct those mistakes.
Kevin, in researching this before the interview, I assumed, it turned out I was wrong, that there's some basic requirements after a storm. For example, the areas most damaged, they get treated and they're put a priority on them. And I didn't assume that there'd be a distinction between a homeowner or a renter, but it turns out that either the requirements aren't being followed or they're not even clear what has to happen, but you're getting senior centers built in areas that weren't even damaged by the storms, and you have other areas that were decimated that haven't seen any money. Can you give an explanation to the audience at home? What are the rules, if there are any, about who gets help and when?
Yeah, so one of the issues that's gotten a lot of attention here recently is that there are people that there are developers that are getting funding to build housing outside of areas that are damaged. And one of the things that's bothered folks is there's been pretty clear political favoritism, with the governor admitting that he did it because he was getting pushed by some folks in the community, one of whom ultimately endorsed him. And while housing throughout the state is needed, and some of that housing has been in counties that were hard hit, what really concerns us is when political favoritism is part of what gets the money spent, And I think it's a legitimate question to ask why the developments that were funded, especially when there's little transparency. We had to sue the state just to get the basic rules that the state is operating under in allocating these funds. And the only place where people can get those rules is on our website. And that's just not right. It's not fair for the state to be hiding the process that is there. One of the other big problems is that they've undercounted the number of renters who are impacted. And although there's going to be more homeowners who need the money than there will be, there's also a lot of renters who have been displaced and need help, and they're not getting it either. And the state is massively underfunded. The funding massively underfunded the programs that are intended for renters, who are now facing a rental market that is tighter than prior to the storm when it hit, and that is leaving a lot of folks doubled up and on friends' couches just because you take an already tight housing market, you destroy a lot of the housing, you take a lot of the homeowners who have now become renters, and the people who were renters and who were lower income are in a really difficult spot, and the state isn't doing enough to help them.
So, Kevin, the person on the outside says, wait a second, we can find the money to do the stronger than the storm ads and whatever else, but who's making sure the money's going where it is? I thought there was a thing called like an integrity monitor, let alone that at a certain point when you're getting contracts, I guess above $5 million, you got HUD that's got to approve it. Can you go through the checks and balances about who's checking where the money is going? And then secondly, are there any thresholds they're going to have to run by the $1.4 billion before it gets spent?
Yeah, so there was a law passed earlier this year that required integrity monitors, which are independent auditors of sorts, people that look out for waste, fraud, and abuse by the state and its contractors. 10 months after that was set up, the programs aren't in place from what we can tell. The state claims that it has put the people in place to monitor this. But what you have is up to $1.8 billion that decisions have been made with regard to. Not much of the money has moved, but decisions have been made that someday it will move and who it will move to and what it will be used for. And those decisions were made without any of the integrity monitors in place. It's like we need integrity monitors for the integrity monitors. The whole process is one that has not had the checks and balances in place that our state law required. And now we're headed to a point where another $1.4 billion would be coming from the federal government, which we desperately need. But if we don't correct the mistakes that have already been made, we just may repeat them. And we and some of the other folks that we work with and some of the people who were impacted by the storm are really pleading for the federal government especially to make sure that the mistakes the Christie administration has already made aren't repeated, to require some sort of acknowledgement by the state that the mistakes were made, to provide a remedy to the people who were treated unfairly, and only then to move on to the $1.4 billion next phase of money, which we need. But we also need to make sure that it's spent fairly and that it's spent in a way that the public has confidence it's being spent well.
Finally, Kevin, more than a year later, from your vantage point, are the problems as to why we are where we are right now because of ineptness, or is it because of politics and everything else took priority over putting these people back in their homes? What has been the big root cause for why we still have such a screwed up situation?
Yeah, I think that there have been problems with incompetence. There have been problems with a lack of transparency by the state. I think that everybody at bottom wants to recover, wants this to be fair, wants their neighbors to get help. And I think that the administration has done a lot of things bad, and certainly we see some signs of politics getting in there. I think at the end of the day, people here are optimistic. We can get past this. We can get to a point where politics aren't playing a role, but instead it's demonstrated need. We just need some help, probably from the federal government, to right the ship a little bit in the right direction, so that we can make sure that the administration moves past some of the incompetence and on to running a system that's free of politics and is, not everybody's going to get help, but at least people want a system that is predictable, that's objective, and that at the end of the day they have confidence, even if they don't get money. I think that at least it was part of a fair analysis.
Well, fair enough, Kevin. I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.